Beloved friends, when we speak of the mind of Christ, we are not speaking of a mind shaped by time, memory, or intellect. We are speaking of a consciousness awakened to the eternal. It is the knowing that life is not something we acquire, fear, defend, or lose, but something that flows from the infinite presence that is nearer than breath and closer than thought. The mind of Christ as divine awareness is the dawning of a consciousness no longer confined to the limitations of human reasoning. It is not an improved intellect or a more refined form of thought, but a fundamental shift from mental activity to spiritual perception. In this awareness, one begins to understand that true knowing does not arise from accumulated knowledge or analytical effort. It appears in the quiet inner space where the presence of God is felt more clearly than the noise of the world. This awareness moves gently, without compulsion, and reveals that life is governed from within, not controlled from the outside. The mind of Christ perceives reality from the standpoint of spirit, not from the instability of human emotions or personal interpretations. It recognizes that every moment is sustained by an invisible presence that is eternally harmonious and self-complete. To awaken to this awareness is to discover a dimension of consciousness untouched by fear, insecurity, or the pressure of survival. Human thinking often functions as a defense against perceived threats, constantly calculating, planning, worrying, and anticipating. But divine awareness dissolves these reactions because it knows that the source of life is infinite and ever-present. In this consciousness, one feels carried rather than burdened, inspired rather than driven. There is a quiet assurance that one is never separate from the source of wisdom and love. This inner knowing does not need to be affirmed repeatedly. It stands on its own, steady and self-sustained. This awareness is also a form of seeing, an inner vision that recognizes truth behind appearances. Instead of reacting to outer events, it responds from an inner calm that senses the spiritual reality hidden beneath every situation. It perceives harmony where the senses detect chaos, sufficiency where the world declares lack, and protection where circumstances suggest danger. This is not denial but recognition of a deeper order that governs life from within. As divine awareness expands, the human mind yields, and one begins to live from an interior light that guides, heals, and reveals without effort. In this state, the mind of Christ becomes the silent foundation of one's being, the invisible center from which all true understanding flows. Freedom from personal will is one of the deepest transitions a spiritual seeker undergoes, for it marks the end of a life driven by fear, desire, and the ceaseless urge to control outcomes. Personal will is rooted in the belief that one stands separate from the infinite and must therefore plan, defend, and strive to secure their good. It operates under the illusion that life is uncertain and must be shaped by force, ambition, or constant effort. But the mind of Christ reveals that true freedom comes when this personal will grows quiet and the deeper movement of divine intention begins to guide one's steps from within. This shift is not passive resignation, it is an inner surrender that opens the door to a more harmonious and effortless way of living. When personal will dominates, the mind is restless. It reacts to appearances, chases goals, and attempts to impose its desires upon the world. It measures success and failure by external results and feels threatened when life does not follow its script. Yet in the silence beneath thought, another dimension of guidance becomes perceptible, a gentle impulse, a quiet assurance, an intuitive knowing that carries no anxiety and seeks no struggle. This is the movement of divine will, and it flows with a rhythm that human planning cannot produce. It leads without pushing, corrects without condemning, and fulfills without strain. As personal will dissolves, there is a new sense of trust, not as an emotional decision, but as an inner recognition that life itself is intelligent. One begins to sense that everything needed comes at the right moment, that every step is revealed as one becomes still enough to discern it. The desire to force outcomes weakens, and the anxiety of uncertainty disappears because one no longer lives from the narrow viewpoint of the separate self. Instead, There is an inner alignment with a presence that knows more than the human mind could ever conceive. In this freedom, decisions become clearer, actions simpler, and experiences gentler because they arise from the flow of divine intention rather than the friction of personal demand. The life once lived through effort is replaced by a life lived through inspiration, and the individual discovers that surrender is not loss, but the beginning of true spiritual liberty. Seeing through spiritual vision instead of judgment is the hallmark of a consciousness transformed by the mind of Christ. Human judgment arises from the surface level of perception. It interprets life through appearances, memories, beliefs, and conditioning. It divides the world into categories of good and bad, safe and unsafe, desirable and undesirable. This form of seeing is narrow because it depends entirely on the testimony of the senses and the conclusions of the intellect. But spiritual vision looks beyond the shifting forms of experience and perceives the deeper reality that underlies them. It recognizes that what meets the eye is never the full story, and that every appearance, pleasant or painful, is only the outer shell of a greater spiritual truth waiting to be discerned. When one begins to live with spiritual vision, the world no longer appears fragmented or threatening. Instead of reacting impulsively to circumstances, one pauses, becomes inwardly still, and allows the deeper intuition to reveal what the senses cannot. Spiritual vision sees harmony where the senses detect disorder because it knows that life is governed by a divine order that cannot be disturbed by temporary appearances. It does not deny the outer condition but refuses to grant it the authority to define reality. Through this inner seeing, fear loses its grip because one senses the presence of an invisible wholeness behind every situation. This vision also alters how one relates to people. Judgment sees flaws, mistakes, inadequacies, and differences. Spiritual vision sees the same divine essence expressing itself uniquely in every individual. Instead of condemning or reacting, one begins to respond with compassion, understanding, and patience. This is not an effort to be virtuous, but a natural outcome of seeing truth rather than illusion. The separateness that fuels conflict dissolves, and relationships take on a softer, more spacious quality. Spiritual vision is quiet, gentle, and effortless. It does not try to analyze or fix the world, but allows truth to reveal itself from within. As this way of seeing deepens, one realizes that appearances are transient shadows, while spiritual reality is enduring and ever-present. Judgment turns into discernment, reaction into peace, and confusion into clarity as the mind of Christ becomes the lens through which all life is perceived. Living from the center of peace is the natural condition of a consciousness aligned with the mind of Christ. It is not a peace created by favorable circumstances, nor is it the result of arranging life to avoid conflict. It is an interior stillness that remains steady while the world around it rises and falls. This peace is not fragile. It does not depend on what is happening in the outer realm. It arises from the profound recognition that life is sustained by a presence greater than any challenge, and that nothing external has the authority to disturb one's inner equilibrium. When a person touches this center, they discover a sanctuary within themselves that is always accessible regardless of conditions. This peace is not indifference or emotional detachment. It is a living awareness of the divine harmony that underlies all existence. Human emotions fluctuate with every change, but the peace of the mind of Christ rests in the certainty that life is one, whole and governed by spiritual law. At this level of consciousness, one does not seek reassurance from the world but experiences a quiet confidence arising from within. There is no impulse to resist, react, or control because one senses that the universe is not chaotic but deeply ordered. This realization becomes a stabilizing force that carries one gently through both joy and difficulty. As this inner peace deepens, one's responses to life transform. Instead of reacting hastily to pressures, one becomes able to pause, breathe, and see with clarity. Decisions become clearer, choices less driven by fear, and interactions with others more compassionate. The world may continue its noise and turbulence, Yet the individual anchored in this peace feels no need to mirror that chaos. They become a calming presence, often without saying a word, because others sense the quiet strength emanating from within. This center of peace is also a place of healing. When the mind is no longer agitated by fear or resistance, the body, emotions, and circumstances begin to reflect the harmony held in consciousness. Solutions rise naturally, guidance becomes more distinct, and life unfolds with a grace that cannot be forced. Living from this center is ultimately the recognition that peace is not something to be achieved, but something already present, waiting to be acknowledged as the truth of one's being. Love as the natural expression of divine mind is not the emotional or sentimental love familiar to human experience. It is not formed through attachment, preference, or personal inclination. Rather, it arises spontaneously from a consciousness that has awakened to the truth of oneness. When the mind of Christ is active within an individual, love flows without effort, without calculation, and without the need for reciprocation. It appears as a gentle radiation from the depths of one's being, much like light effortlessly emanates from the sun. This love does not ask, who deserves it? Nor does it measure how much to give, it simply shines because its source is inexhaustible. Human love is often conditional, shaped by personal desires and needs. It reacts to behaviors influenced by moods and can shift with circumstances. But divine love does not waver, because it does not originate in the human personality. It is the expression of the divine nature within, and therefore it remains constant, unchanging, and pure. When one touches this level of consciousness, love no longer feels like a duty or a moral achievement. One does not strive to be kind, compassionate, or forgiving. These qualities arise naturally because the inner barriers that once blocked the flow of love have dissolved. In this state, one begins to see others through spiritual vision rather than judgment. The flaws, mistakes, and differences that once triggered reactions lose their power because one senses the same divine essence in every individual. Compassion becomes instinctive. Forgiveness becomes immediate. Generosity becomes effortless. There is no fear of giving too much, because one knows that love is not a personal possession that can be depleted, but a divine activity that flows through an open and receptive consciousness. This love also becomes a healing presence. Without speaking a word, one's very atmosphere brings comfort, peace, and reassurance to others. Conflicts lose intensity, misunderstandings soften, and relationships deepen because divine love operates as a harmonizing influence. It requires no strategy or technique, its power lies in its purity. To live with love as the natural expression of divine mind is to live as a conduit of the infinite, allowing the unseen currents of spirit to bless, uplift, and transform the world around us simply by being what we truly are. Union with God as the source of all illumination is the recognition that the essence of our being is not separate from the infinite that created us. It is the quiet discovery that the divine presence we seek outside has always been the life within us, sustaining every breath, directing every moment, and forming the very substance of our existence. This realization does not arise from intellectual belief or religious doctrine. It comes as an inner awakening, a moment when one senses that the boundary between the human and the divine was never real. In this union, one no longer feels like an isolated individual struggling to navigate life, but an expression of a vast, harmonious intelligence that knows the way even when the mind does not. As this awareness deepens, a new kind of clarity begins to emerge. Illumination is not a flash of brilliance or a sudden burst of extraordinary insight. It is a steady light that reveals the spiritual reality underlying all things. One begins to understand situations intuitively, without the strain of analysis. Guidance comes naturally, often without words, as a movement of inner certainty. This certainty does not arise from personal knowledge, but from the realization that the same wisdom that governs the universe also governs one's own life. Decisions become simpler, actions more aligned, and outcomes more graceful because they emerge from a consciousness that is not divided against itself. Union with God also dissolves the sense of fear and loneliness that arises from believing we are separate beings. In this awareness, one feels held, supported and accompanied by a presence that never wavers. This is not a psychological comfort, but a spiritual fact experienced directly in the silence of the heart. The more one rests in this union, the more one recognizes that all true strength, guidance, peace and fulfillment flow from the infinite, not from human effort. This union naturally expresses itself in daily life. One becomes more patient, more compassionate, more understanding, not as a moral effort, but because the divine nature within begins to shine unobstructed. Life unfolds with a sense of purpose and harmony, not because one orchestrates it, but because illumination reveals the path step by step. In this state, the mind of Christ becomes not an aspiration, but a realized truth, guiding every moment from within. In the end, the message of the mind of Christ reveals itself as an invitation to live